Many things influence listening comprehension in Chinese. Some are related to the language and some to the situation. But some are also related to you as a listener. How can you become a better listener in Mandarin? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to return to my article series about listening comprehension called Beyond tīng dǒng, where we try to, well, as the name implies, go beyond simply noting that we don't understand when somebody says something in Chinese to try to understand why this is the case and, of course, also by extension, what we can do about it, and thereby improve our listening ability. Since there is a listening challenge starting on May 10th, I thought this was a good timing to get back to this series and keep discussing listening comprehension in Chinese. For more about the challenge, you can head over to challenges.hackingchinese.com or check the link in the description. So this will be the fifth article in this series about listening comprehension, and as you can tell from that fact, this is a rather in-depth look. So it's not just a cursory look at listening comprehension, we're really digging into the details here. I don't think you have to have listened to the previous parts, but it certainly will help, and if you want to understand listening comprehension, I have covered some of the really crucial things in the previous episodes. If you want to listen to those, the series started in episode 111, then kept going in episode 112, then 121, and finally 123. The easiest way to access these is, of course, to head over to the written articles on Hacking Chinese, because all those contain links to all the others, and you can also find the podcast episodes embedded in those articles. The first part in the series was just an introduction, and the second and third parts covered bottom-up and top-down processing. So here, bottom-up processing refers to synthesizing meaning from smaller parts, so we build from basic sounds upwards to words and sentences and then understanding. Whereas top-down processing is the opposite. It is when we rely on things we already know to make it easier to understand something new that we are listening to. Then in part 4, we looked at controlled and automated processing and basically said that there are some things we can do by focusing on them and we can get better results by focusing on key things, but that the vast majority of listening needs to be highly automated to work, and this can only come with practice. So in this part and the upcoming 3 parts, we're going to look at various factors that influence the difficulty of listening in Chinese. So in this part, we will look at listener factors, so those that are related to you as a listener. What can you do, or what is it about you that makes it hard or easy to listen to something? And then in the next part, we will look at factors relating to the language you are listening to. So that can be things related to the Chinese language itself, but it can also be things about the passage you're listening to, such as the complexity, the length, and things like that. And so the last factors relate to the listening situation. So for example, are you in a conversation? Are you listening to something directed at you, directed at somebody else, and so on? These all influence the difficulty of listening. But like I said, in this episode, we are focusing on you, the listener. The goal of Hacking Chinese is to help you find better ways of learning Mandarin, and this means that I normally focus on things that you can improve and that you should try to optimize to get the most out of your learning. For example, when I discuss approaches to learning Mandarin in the most general sense, I tend to say that there are 3 important factors: your method, or how you learn, the content, or what you're learning, and then finally time, or how many hours you invest into learning. But in this discussion, I don't include some obvious things you might have thought of. For example, age has an influence on how much Chinese we learn, but that is not something I discuss explicitly in that article. I even mentioned that I don't include it, and the reason is very simple: you can't do anything about your age. And that means that from a learner perspective, it's not terribly interesting to discuss, because what are you supposed to do? Yeah, everybody knows that you should have started learning Mandarin as early as possible, but you are where you are right now and you make decisions based on that. Nobody has a time machine, and therefore age is not terribly interesting to me. This is why I hesitated a little bit before writing the first section of the article, which focuses on cognitive abilities, because this, according to research, is definitely something that does influence listening, and we are not all made equal in this regard. For example, your ability to store and manipulate information held in your working memory has been shown to be closely linked to comprehension, but since there is no established way to improve working memory, is it really meaningful to discuss this? Does it help anybody? Well, I'll leave that to decide for you, but I at least think that there is a point in discussing these things briefly, and it's not because I found a revolutionary way to improve working memory storage and processing, but because I think that knowing about them can make learning less frustrating, and when you understand why something is difficult, maybe it becomes a little bit less difficult. There is a substantial amount of research into the link between working memory and understanding, both when it comes to listening comprehension and reading comprehension, and both in one's native language and any subsequently learned languages. In order for this episode not to read like a term paper, I will not pepper it with references, so if you want those, you can head over to the written article, and you can also check the references and further reading at the bottom of the article on Hacking Chinese. Now, as I discussed in the previous part in this series, the one about controlled and automated processing, we are all very limited when it comes to how much information we can store in our working memory and how fast we can process it, although we differ in exactly how limited we are and how fast this processing is. The clearest illustration I have of this from a Chinese learning perspective is when the teacher reads a sentence to you and asks you to repeat it after the teacher. And this is incredibly hard, and it's much harder than the teacher thinks. I've been exposed to this many times as a student. So let's say the teacher reads a sentence from the textbook. I don't have any written reference, and I'm supposed to say it back. But I don't remember half the sentence, and even if it's a short sentence and you're a beginner, you will find this very difficult. As we talked about in part 2 of this series, this is because we haven't automated the processing enough, and we can't chunk what we're hearing, and therefore it takes up a lot of space in our memory, whereas a more experienced learner would be able to chunk this and deal with it much more efficiently than we would as a beginner. One way of looking at it is to say that working memory is a little bit like a mental workbench. It has a certain surface area where you can put things, and you can manipulate things that are on this bench at a certain speed. And it follows then that if the bench is not big enough, or you can't manipulate the things on the bench quickly enough, you won't be able to construct meaning out of the pieces you hear quickly enough. Having a bigger bench and being better at using it also means that there is capacity left to do other things, such as using strategies or attending to what you priorly knew about the topic, or maybe some background information that might be relevant. However, it's worth pointing out that these relationships are not fully mapped out yet, and we know that working memory has a different impact depending on the context, depending on the kind of listening task you're doing, and so on. But in general, working memory is clearly linked to listening and reading comprehension, and there is very little we can do about this except making the processing itself more efficient, and see the previous part for more about that. So as a learner, I would say it's perfectly natural to feel overwhelmed when listening to unfamiliar content. This happens to all of us, and it's not because you are stupid. It's okay to not be able to hold a long clause in your mind while waiting for the final piece that will make it all come together and make sense. Listening to Mandarin as a beginner sometimes feels like throwing 11 balls into the air and hoping to juggle them all, and then you catch one or maybe two and all the rest just fall to the ground. This is alright, you will improve with practice, and over time you will learn to juggle. The next category of factors that I want to discuss are metacognitive skills. So, whereas cognition is about thinking, knowing, and understanding, metacognition is then about thinking, knowing, and reasoning about cognition itself. So it's one abstraction level above. So, for example, you are engaged in some kind of metacognition when listening to this episode because you are thinking about your own listening comprehension. Another example would be knowledge about strategies you can apply when listening to Chinese, and we will talk a little bit about that in a bit. A third and final example would be using what you've learned throughout this series and apply that to your own learning and try to plot a path for your listening comprehension and listening practice so that you'll be able to reach your goals. So all these are about thinking and reasoning about your own learning and your own listening in particular, in this case, of course. And note that it's metacognitive skills, so skills are something we can develop with time and with practice. So unlike the cognitive abilities that I discussed earlier, metacognitive skills can definitely be developed, and there is a lot of research in this area, and it's rather encouraging, meaning that there are many things you can do and that you can learn about listening ability that really will make you able to understand more of what you're listening to. Since this is an important topic and also a rather practical one, I don't want to just summarize things as I'm going to do here, so we will devote an entire article to this later in this series. But for now, let's just look at some different categories of strategies, and these are from Van de Grift et al. 2006. So the first category is planning and evaluation. So this refers to strategies that you apply before you listen or when you plan for listening. And there are a couple of things you can do here that are very helpful. So one is to consider the purpose of listening. What information are you after? And if you think about it, in real-world listening, this is a thing. You're listening to someone because you're interested in hearing about something, or if you've just asked someone a question, you're interested in hearing the answer. Another metacognitive skill in this category is to try to predict what you think someone is going to say. And you can do this based on what they look like, where they are, the general situation, context. If it's a listening comprehension exercise, maybe there are pictures, maybe there's something else you know in advance. So try to pay attention to those things. Then you can also consider what you know about this in Chinese. What words do you think they are likely to use? And simply by thinking about these things, you make it more likely that your brain will activate the correct patterns and memories when you are actually listening, and this will speed up processing significantly. The next category of metacognitive skills is problem solving. And this is something we have discussed when we discussed top-down processing. I talked about using what you already know to interpret what you're hearing. And that's a kind of problem solving. Maybe you think you heard something, but then you can draw the conclusion that this must be wrong because you also know that what you heard can't be right based on your prior knowledge or something this person has said before. So provided that you have the cognitive resources to spare, you might be able to resolve this problem and actually understand what's going on. It could also be that you fail to hear something, and just because you know enough grammar, you know enough about the conversation in general, you can kind of guess what that word was, at least if you give yourself the chance to. So the most important advice here is to keep an active attitude towards what you're listening to and always try to use what you do understand in order to make sense of what you don't understand. The next category is mental translation, and this is something we are all too familiar with. When we listen to a language that's new to us, we are of course trying to translate this into our native language because that's a way of making sense of it. But the problem is that this is not a feasible way of listening. You can never translate things to your native language quickly enough for this to be a viable strategy. There is no magic way that just allows you to stop doing this instantly, but at least trying to do so will help. And also, this comes with practice too, because the more times you've heard a word in different contexts, the easier it will be to understand without feeling the need to translate it to English or whatever your native language happens to be. The fourth category is self-knowledge, and this is being aware of your own ability, the difficulty of the listening task, and what you feel about these. So some learners have a realistic expectation, they know that something might be challenging, they are aware of why it's challenging, and they feel it's okay to fail. And if you have such a positive and relaxed attitude, you are more likely to do well on listening. As we shall see later in this episode though, negative emotions and being stressed and things like that can have a negative impact on your listening comprehension as well. The fifth and final category of metacognitive skills is directed attention. And this is simply your ability to concentrate on what you are supposed to concentrate on. As we saw in the previous part in this episode, this controlled processing, when you focus consciously on something you're listening to, can help you with certain things, but it will never be enough. You also need the automated processing. But if you're focusing on something completely different, you will definitely not understand much of what you're listening to, or indeed you are not even listening. For example, if your mind drifts off and you start daydreaming about unicorns or suddenly find yourself focusing on the speaker's eccentric earrings or something like that, comprehension will of course suffer. So therefore, you need to learn and apply strategies that allow you to focus on what you're listening to. And while this can be different from different learners, of course, personally, I find it very useful to echo what I hear someone say inside my own head. I'm not saying it aloud, it's just a kind of mental shadowing. And this allows me to stay focused on the words, what they are saying. And this can be rather important, especially if you have, say, a longer listening test or something like that. You're supposed to listen for 40 minutes, and if you slip for like a minute in the middle, maybe you lose a crucial few points you needed to pass the exam. Van de Grift and his colleagues actually developed an interesting questionnaire you can use with students, and here you refers to teachers, and it's called the Metacognitive Awareness Listening Questionnaire, or MALQ. But unfortunately, this is not publicly available, but if you have access to, say, a university library or some other way of accessing papers, I suggest you check it out, and you can actually use it yourself. You can take the questionnaire and see which areas of the above I just mentioned you lack the most or where you are the strongest, and therefore you can identify what you need to work more on. So moving on to the next big category of factors related to you as a listener and how that influences your listening ability, we are going to talk about prior experience and exposure to the language. Of course, it goes without saying that you can't understand Mandarin if you haven't heard it before, and some of the things that you gain by listening a lot and being exposed to the language, such as a broad vocabulary, knowledge about the sound system, and so on, are things that are extremely important, probably the most important things for listening comprehension. As we saw in the previous part of this episode, it's also the case that when you have listened a lot, you also build up this automated processing, and that allows you to free up more cognitive resources to do the more demanding things, such as the strategies I just talked about. So I think this is rather obvious, so I'm not going to dwell that much on this category, but I will go through a few different areas that have been identified to be extra important. And the first one is vocabulary size. And while it is true that you can employ different strategies to guess the meaning of unknown words and things like that, if you don't know enough words, it's going to be very hard, right? This is something we discussed in episode 6 of the podcast, so I won't dwell on it here. The next area is phonological awareness, and that refers to your understanding of the sound system. So, for example, your ability to differentiate different sounds, identify tones, and tell where one syllable ends and the next begins, and things like that. This is, of course, also built up over time, and we already talked about this in part 2 at great length, so please refer to that episode if you want to learn more. I do want to point out, though, that this is not about theoretical understanding. You don't need to be able to verbalize this knowledge, but your brain certainly needs to be able to do these things in order to understand spoken Mandarin. The next area is syntactical awareness, and that's the same thing but for grammar and word structure and things like that. So, for example, a learner that has better grammatical understanding of Chinese than another will also be better at guessing what word might fit in a certain location. So let's say that your brain has identified 2 candidate words that might work in a sentence, but if one of them doesn't even work in this sentence because maybe it's a verb where you would expect a noun or something like that, then your brain can rely on this knowledge to determine what word you actually hear. And this is of course not something you are aware of that it happens, but it does happen all the time when successful listening happens. The next area is background knowledge, and this is something we spent the entirety of part 3 of this series talking about, so I will just summarize it briefly here. Basically, we saw that there are 3 types of knowledge that you need to have that aren't related to the language itself, because we covered that already, right? We covered grammar, words, and phonology. But if we are talking about things outside of the language, there are still things you need to know in order to listen and be successful. The first is pragmatic knowledge, and this refers to how words are used and interpreted in context, and usually beyond what they mean literally. So, for example, if someone says "Nichilama," you need to understand that this can be a greeting, not just a straight-up question to ask you whether you've had dinner or not. You also need discourse knowledge, and this would be information or knowledge about the structure of a conversation in a given context. So when you go to a restaurant, you expect certain things to happen, and knowing about what's supposed to happen makes it much easier to interpret what people are saying in this situation. Finally, you also need information about the world, and this can be things related to a culture you're not very familiar with or a part of the world you're not very familiar with. And this is also necessary to interpret spoken language correctly. So all these factors are built by exposing yourself to more Chinese, and preferably in diverse contexts. And of course, it shouldn't be a surprise that successful learners tend to have spent lots of time engaging with the language. The key here is, of course, to listen more, which is always good, but also to try to diversify your listening to make sure you cover lots of different contexts. Finally, we are going to talk about affective factors that influence listening comprehension. Sometimes, simply thinking that understanding is impossible will make you less likely to understand. And when you feel anxious, concentration starts slipping and you can't focus on what you are listening to. The most well-known take on this is Stephen Krashen's The Affective Filter, which is part of his monitor model. And the idea here is that emotions can act as a barrier to input, meaning that if you feel anxious or stressed or maybe even scared, less of the input is available for processing. You could also argue that if you are stressed or feeling bad, you have less capacity left to process the language because you're busy thinking about other things, or at least being influenced by these negative emotions. Anecdotally, I think we can all refer to this. Listening to something from the comfort of your home is a lot easier than trying to understand the same thing in a high-stakes test situation, for example. And understanding what a cute person is saying to you is harder than listening to the same as a recording on your phone or similar. However, we don't need to rely on anecdotal evidence for this because there's plenty of research to show that emotions do in fact influence our ability to understand spoken Chinese. And not only that in fact, but also cognitive abilities in general. Fortunately, there is also research that shows that you can counter these negative emotions by trying to build positive ones and to try to build a safe environment in which to practice. And just as a reminder, most of the things I'm talking about here have references on Hacking Chinese if you want to read more. Naturally, it's important that you try to stay positive and make your learning experience as enjoyable as possible, not just because you are able to understand more when you're in a good mood, but also because it makes listening itself and learning Chinese itself more enjoyable, which in turn will allow you to spend much more time engaging with the language and therefore you will learn more. And this is exactly what I was talking about in that article about the factors that influence how much you learn that I talked about at the beginning of this episode. Having fun while learning Chinese is actually rather serious, as in if you fail to do this, you will probably not learn much because it will be too hard to invest the time necessary. So it's time to wrap up this discussion about becoming a better listener as a student of Chinese. We have seen that some of the factors that are related to you as a listener and determines how much you understand are things you only have a limited influence over, such as your working memory. But we can also see that by exposing yourself to the language and learning more and becoming more experienced, you can also do a lot more with the resources that you do have. There are also many strategies you can use to improve your listening comprehension, and the good news here is that they are much easier to learn and implement than it is to, say, spend another 1,000 hours listening to Chinese to build your experience. Beyond implementing these strategies into your own listening, you should also pay attention to emotional factors and try to gradually build a capacity to deal with more demanding situations. Even though I have said this many times already in this series and elsewhere, I do want to highlight the importance of practice. The more you listen, the better, and the more you understand what you're listening to, the better as well. By listening more, you will be able to automate more of the processing, which frees up cognitive resources to deal with the difficult bits and do all this problem solving, strategy usage, and so on that we have discussed. You will, of course, also learn words, grammar, sounds, and so on naturally by listening a lot, and there is really no way around that. So in this episode, we talked about factors relating to you as a listener, and in the upcoming episodes in this series, we will talk about factors related to the language you're listening to and to the situation you are listening in. Those will not be published in the coming few weeks because I have a feeling that not everybody is interested in this kind of content, but maybe I'm wrong, and if you think I am wrong, you should let me know by leaving a comment over at Hacking Chinese. As usual, my hope is that you will be able to take the information that I present and apply it to your own learning situation and make learning Mandarin a little bit easier for you. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.